It is my honor and privilege to welcome you to the annual JCRC 2024 Community-Wide Yom HaShoah Commemoration. It is our sacred obligation to the 6 million who perished during the Holocaust and to the survivors who battled to liberate the world from oppression. Today, with witnesses and their descendants, we remember and mourn. Thank you to everyone with putting on today's program, including co-chairs Ira Barfield, Ellen Blaylock, and Albert Bloomfield, Executive Director Ron Halber, Gila Siegel, Sarah Winkleman, Mandy Book, the Day Schools, Generations After, 3GDC, Jessa, and our sponsoring synagogues, Bethel, Alexandria, and Tikvot, Israel, and the entire JCRC staff. I also want to mention the dedicated community leaders on our Holocaust Commission, many who have served this committee since its beginning years ago. This event could not happen without you. Today, we mourn the passing of our dear friend Nessie Godin, who devoted her life to ensure that the memory of the Holocaust would never be forgotten. The JCRC sponsors this yearly event, provides the Speakers Bureau for Holocaust Education and Memory, and works continuously for expanded funding for vulnerable Holocaust survivors. Daily, we advocate for vigorous public policy responses to anti-Semitism and all types of isms.
This year's Yom HaShoah has taken on new significance as we witness Hamas commit the worst mass murder of Jews in a single day since World War II. The war that Hamas initiated also set off an extremely disturbing rise in anti-Semitism around the world, on college campuses, and even here at home. The unleashing of anti-Semitism was not caused by the war. The speed and the widespread nature of the incidents proved that our society was predisposed to believe the worst things about Israel and Jews without much prompting. What the war has done is give permission to people to openly express their anti-Semitic views in public forums and directly to our face. Thank God we still live in a country where the police and the FBI are here to protect us, quite unlike the Europe of the 1930s and 40s. How sad it is that we need to call them so frequently and use so many of our communal resources just to keep us safe. Let us be clear, we are not living in 1930s Germany. I wear my kippah around town and fly an Israeli flag from my front porch without fear of an attack. My children and their friends are recent graduates or students at some of the best universities in the country, and they live actively Jewish lives. These are also campuses where there have been anti-Israel referendums, rallies, exclusion from participating in certain multicultural groups. While these incidents have made them angry and the vitriolic language used by others has been disturbing, they have not been in physical danger. They have not needed to hide their Jewish identity, although some of their friends have chosen to do so. But as Ambassador Lipstadt teaches us, we should not wait until it becomes Nazi Germany before we take action, because by that point it will be too late. Yesterday, in shuls around the world, we read Acharei Mot, following the death of Aaron's two sons. And this coming Shabbat, we will read Kedoshim, holiness. Each year when we come to these parshiot, I'm struck by the concept, Acharei Mot, after death, there can be Kedoshim. From the fields of death, we can grow holiness. In March, I was touched by a story in the New York Times of Martin Greenfield, a Holocaust survivor who died at the age of 95. Greenfield learned to sew in the laundry room of Auschwitz after he was beaten for ripping a soldier's shirt. He stole the shirt and then another and wore them under his clothes, making people think he was someone important and allowing him to get extra food and to survive. When he arrived in New York in 1947 with $10 in his pocket, he was able to use those skills to get a job working on the floor at GGG Men's Clothier. He learned every aspect of clothing manufacturing and quickly moved up the ranks within the company and bought the factory in 1977, renaming it Greenfield Clothiers. In his 2014 memoir titled Measure of a Man, From Auschwitz Survivor to President's Tailor, Greenfield wrote that he made suits for Dwight Eisenhower, who had personally toured the camp from where he was liberated, and almost every president from Gerald Ford to Joe Biden, as well as entertainers like Eddie Cantor, Frank Sinatra, and Denzel Washington, and athletes like Kobe Bryant, LeBron James, Carmelo Anthony. He fulfilled a promise that he made his father, to live his life for him. Acharei Mot Kedoshim. After death, there can be a renewed holiness. This is one of many examples of Holocaust survivors who went on to successful careers and lives after they were liberated. Throughout his life, Greenfield was able to see the best and the worst of what humans can do, and he chose to focus on being the best. Acharei Mot Kedoshim is not automatic. There are far too many stories of people who survived the camps, but were not able to move beyond the experience. We don't know why, but we do know that Kedoshim is only possible, Acharei Mot, after death, if we work to make it happen. It is not guaranteed. And perhaps that is the lesson of this Yom HaShoah. I was in Israel in November and just returned from a month of volunteering there. And I met people who fall into both camps, people who may never leave their home again, and people determined to build something meaningful from the ashes. The choice is not always ours to make, but we must try. We must believe in the possibility of Kedoshim, even when we are in the midst of Acharei Mot. We don't know if we have hit the worst of the anti-Semitism in America, or if it's still on the upswing. But we can make choices to live our lives in Kedoshim, to remember our responsibilities to the stranger in our midst, for we were strangers in the land of Egypt, to care for the most vulnerable members of our society, to love our neighbors as we love ourselves. I pray that with all the anger and pain we have endured Acharei Mot, following the deaths on October 7th, we can also still hold the vision of the Martin Greenfields and create Kedoshim, making our world a more holy place for all. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Dina Litto-Hirsch. I'm the daughter of 2 Holocaust survivors and a member of the board of directors of the Generations After and one of its representatives on the JCRC's Holocaust Commission, where I first met the late Nessie Godin some 25 years ago. It is my distinct, though sad privilege, to honor Nessie's memory today. Nessie was born in Šiauliai, Lithuania on March 28, 1928. During the Holocaust, she survived in the ghetto there, the Stutthof concentration camp, 4 slave labor camps, and a death march. She was 13 when the Nazis invaded Lithuania and 17 when the Soviets liberated her. In the many talks she gave, Nessie spoke about the women whose kindness saved her life. In one talk she said, "These Jewish women gave me a bite of bread, wrapped my body in straw to keep me warm, picked me up when I was on the ground, helped me up when I was hurt by the guards, and gave me hope when I was ready to give up." In return, they asked the teenage girl to promise that she would remember them and that she would teach the world what hatred, prejudice, and indifference can do to humanity. Nessie and her beloved late husband Jack immigrated to the United States in 1950, settling in Washington, D.C. They raised their family here, daughter Penina, son Edward, or Eddie as Nessie always called him, and daughter Rochelle. Nessie never forgot the promise she made to these women and spent her life teaching those lessons to thousands of people in a variety of audiences, including U.S. military academies and government agencies, schools, churches, synagogues, civic groups, and the many visitors to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, where she was an active and cherished volunteer. The introduction to the Mourner's Prayer in the prayer book I grew up with said, in part, "Look into the heavens, you who mourn. There still gleams in your eyes the light of lives that have faded many centuries ago. Those who have gone from us are immortal. They live on in you and in those who come after you." Certainly, this is true of our friend and inspiration, the late Nessie Godin. And just as certainly, her name will be a blessing.
In 1941, when I just was a 3-year-old child, my mother, my grandmother, my grandfather, and I, we fled Leningrad to escape the Nazis. It was a scary time filled with danger. Sadly, my father could not pass through these hard days. We found safety in Tajikistan, where my mom works hard for us. After the war, she returned briefly to Leningrad, but it was not the same. Our apartment was occupied by a family of strangers, and it was not also ours anymore. We lost everything. The only thing that my mom managed to rescue was a beautiful turquoise vase. It was a wedding gift for my parents. And since then, it became a symbol of our Holocaust survival. I carried it through my life, and now my son, Sergei, next generation in our family, keeps this vase. He will pass down the vase to my grandkids, so they will never forget. I light to this candle for my mother, for my father, for my grandmother and grandfather, along with all those who lost their lives in Holocaust.
I was born in 1925 in Breslau, Germany, as the only child of Martin and Ruth Cohn, who had a sporting goods store. But by 1938, because of Nazi persecution, they had lost their ability to earn a living and decided to escape to the United States on visitor's visa. We arrived in the States in 1938 in October, and in November was Crystal Night, which we thereby had avoided. And subsequently, President Roosevelt issued an executive order that no one would be forced to return to Germany. We were thus saved. As soon as I was 18 years old in 1943, I was drafted into the U.S. Army, and I went overseas and became an intelligence agent and worked in that capacity during the Battle of the Bulge, the Rhineland campaigns, the Central Europe campaign, as well as in the Army of Occupation. And I remained in the military for a total of 35 years, retiring in 1978 in the rank of colonel. I now would like to light the candle to commemorate the 12 million people who were killed by the Nazis in Germany, including 6 million Jews, and among them were 11 members of my extended family. I do this with the motto, never again.
My family roots are in the Czech lands where they lived for many generations. They refused to leave in the 30s when the threat of the Nazi became obvious. They believed that it was their homeland and nothing could happen to them. Sadly, that was a fatal mistake. 15% of the Jewish population survived the ravages of the war. Among the many victims were many of my relatives. I only knew my maternal grandmother. My paternal grandparents were deported from Pilsen, the city where they lived, to Theresienstadt. From there, 7 months later, they were sent on a train hundreds of miles east to Tallinn in Estonia. I also lost my father's older brother, his wife, and their young daughter, my cousin Helenka. In a normal world, both my father's and mother's families would have continued to thrive in their homeland, and I would have been able to play with my little cousin. An elaborate wedding was planned for my parents, Oscar and Trude Lowy, in the spring of 1939. But my grandfather, Moritz Lowy, was arrested, and the wedding was postponed until his release. Soon, the Czech lands were occupied by Germany, and the writing was on the wall. My parents were hastily married, leaving immediately for their honeymoon in northern Italy, not to return until after the war. My father could never talk about his family that he lost, but the pain of that loss was evident in many ways every day of his life. In lighting this memorial candle, we dedicate it to the memory of our family and the 6 million who perished in the Shoah, including 1.5 million innocent children.
On this Yom HaShoah, I remember my grandfather Solomon Wagshaw, whose job as a diamond cutter in Antwerp, Belgium, was taken over upon German occupation, after which he was sent to a work camp in the north of France. He escaped, found help with the French underground, and spent the rest of the war working as a farmhand, pretending that he was deaf and mute so as not to give himself away. On this Yom HaShoah, I remember my grandmother Yetta Wagshaw, who escaped initial deportation because of a hospital stay for her stomach ulcers. Her luck ran out, though, and she was taken from that hospital bed, sent to Mechlin, and then on to Auschwitz. She somehow survived, weighing just 70 pounds at liberation. On this Yom HaShoah, I remember my uncle Sam Wagshaw, When his mother Yetta left for the hospital, Sam, along with my aunt and my father, were placed into a Belgian orphanage run jointly by a Jewish social service agency and the Gestapo. When the Gestapo would come to the home looking for children to fill their transports, Sam was sent to hide at the home of a priest. He could vividly recall nights spent hiding under a bed there, attempting to escape the sounds of the gunshots whirring past his windows. On this Yom HaShoah, I think of my Aunt Sabina Wagshaw, the eldest of the Wagshaw siblings and the only one still alive. At 87 years old, she still lives with and tells us stories of the childhood she spent taking care of her little brothers in that orphanage, a pretty big task for a 7-year-old full of fear. On this Yom HaShoah, I think of my dad, Jack Wagshaw. The youngest of the siblings, he was just 4 years old when he found himself without parents at this strange home with other orphans the Nazis had created by stealing their parents. His hair was fire engine red and his personality matched. When the Gestapo came for the Wagshaw children, he and Sabina were dropped into a forest because it wasn't easy to hide a kid like my dad. Not only did he survive those cold, sleepless weeks living off berries in the woods, but he survived the whole thing. I honestly don't know how, but they all did. A combination of luck, determination, and the kindness of others saved the Wagshaw family. But the Book of Names in Auschwitz tells of many other Wagshaws, and of course, 6 million other Jewish people who did not survive. Our family has continued, and I am so grateful for that, especially when I look at my 2 sons and my 2 brothers' children who live their lives honoring the legacy of my dad. I light this candle for all those whose stories did not end in survival, and for those who did. Solomon and Yetta Wagshaw, Sam Wagshaw, Sabina Wagshaw, and my dad, who I miss so much, Jack Wagshaw.
My grandfather was born in Łódź, Poland in 1929 to a middle-class Jewish family. After the Nazis invaded Poland, his entire family was forced into the Łódź ghetto, where they remained right up until its liquidation. At that point, they were sent to Birkenau, where tragically my grandfather's mother and father both died. The Nazis then sent my grandfather to a munitions factory and finally to a concentration camp called Allum outside of Hanover in Germany, where he was forced to dig tunnels for the Nazis. When the American troops were marching toward the camp, the Nazis rounded up all of the surviving Jews and launched them on a death march. My grandfather was able to avoid that fate by hiding in the tunnel that he was helping to construct. He survived just barely, long enough to be liberated by a group of Americans that included Henry Kissinger. After the war, he reunited with his 3 sisters, who remarkably also survived. They emigrated to the United States, and my grandfather joined the Air Force, eventually settling in Sumter, South Carolina, where he met my grandmother, Rhea. There were not a ton of Jews there, but those 2 fell in love and had a wonderful marriage that lasted decades. They had 3 children, including my father. And my grandfather was lucky enough to live to see 2 grandchildren. Unfortunately, he died in 2021 at the age of 92, and he was not able to meet my son, who was born last year. But I am so honored to be lighting this candle in his memory. It's truly a heavy burden to be a 3rd generation survivor, and at the same time, in many ways, a blessing, because I feel I'm able to tell this story, to speak these truths that were passed down to me by a witness, by a survivor himself. And so I light this candle in his memory, and in the memory of the 6 million Jews who perished.
We say never again all the time. Yet, on October 7th, 2023, we had the deadliest day of Jews since the Holocaust. Now, More than ever, the statement "never again" is needed. Many of the people who were affected by October 7th massacre were Holocaust survivors. Some of the people who were taken hostage are Holocaust survivors. Those survivors have already lived through a lifetime amount of traumatic suffering. Chaim Ranan says he survived 2 Holocausts. The first was as a boy in a Jewish ghetto in Hungary during World War II. The second was in a kibbutz in southern Israel, hiding in a safe room beside his grandson, who was around the same age as he was during the Nazis' persecution. Chaim said, "In the kibbutz Be'eri massacre, I know every single person, every single member of my kibbutz and their children. For me, it was a second Holocaust." We have to remember what happened in the Holocaust and what are the dangers of anti-Semitism and blind hatred is. It is mandatory in order to tackle this horrific rooted problem. Otherwise, history will keep repeating itself. Therefore, Holocaust education is so essential to assure that it really, really will never happen again.
I was just 13 weeks old, feverish, cold, hungry, hidden in the forest, when my parents made the very difficult choice to give me away in order to save my life. I survived by the grace of God and because of the compassion and courage of a Ukrainian couple who risked their lives to keep me safe for 2.5 years. In memory of all who were murdered and on behalf of all who survived the Shoah, I recite this legacy of the survivors. We take this oath. We take it in the shadows of the flames whose tongues scar the souls of our people. We vow in the names of our dead parents and children. We vow with our sadness hidden, our faith renewed. We vow we shall never let the sacred memory of our perished 6 million brethren be forgotten or erased. We saw them hungry in fear. We saw them in the loneliness of night. We saw them at the threshold of death, true to their faith. We received their silence in silence. We merged their tears with ours. We are the remaining witnesses of deportations, executions, mass graves, death camps, of mute prayers, hidden souls, and cries of revolt. The young, the old, the rich and the poor, the ghetto fighters, the partisans, the scholars and the messianic dreamers, the tradesmen and businessmen, the Hasidim and Misnagdim. Like a cloud, we saw them vanish. We take this oath. Vision becomes word, to be handed down from father to son, from mother to daughter, handed down from generation to generation. Zachor, Zachor, remember what the Nazi murderers and their accomplices did to our Jewish people. Remember them with rage and contempt. Remember what an indifferent world did to us and to itself. We also must remember the good deeds of the righteous Gentiles. In 1981, we took this oath in Israel near the Kotel. There, we handed down a legacy to our children.
in the shadows of the flames of 6 symbolic candles. Today at this assembly, we reaffirm our oath in the shadows of the flames of these 6 yahrzeit candles, honoring the memory of our 6 million. Achenu b'nei Israel, our Jewish brethren, we take this oath. Our memory will become words of history of the Holocaust, to be handed down from generation to generation, midor ledor. Unsere Kedoshim, wir wollen euch keinmal nicht vergessen.
My name is Tamara Meyer, and I'm making this pledge in honor of my mother, Ursula Meyer Netochek. We, who are your sons and daughters, belong to a generation in which every attempt was made for us never to exist. We who represent your victory and triumph over evil of unthinkable dimensions accept the responsibility to preserve and protect the legacy of the Holocaust. We pledge to commemorate, we pledge to educate, we pledge to forever remember. We pledge to you, our mothers and fathers who suffered in ways words can never describe, that our commitment is an everlasting commitment for this generation and for every generation to come. We dedicate this pledge to our beloved grandmothers and grandfathers who never lived to see us. We dedicate this pledge to our aunts, uncles, cousins, brothers, and sisters who are forever missing from our lives. We dedicate this pledge to all the 6 million Jewish men, women, and children who were so brutally murdered, but who will always be in our thoughts and in our hearts, and will always be remembered.
On behalf of 3GDC, the organization representing grandchildren of Holocaust survivors in the National Capital Region, and all 3Gs remembering our families this Yom HaShoah, I'm honored to recite this year's Pledge of Continuation. My grandfather Joseph was the only one from his family of 7 to survive after his peaceful town was overrun by Nazis and their enthusiastic collaborators. Along with my grandmother Edith, an Auschwitz survivor, Joseph rebuilt his life here in America and testified to the horrors he endured. For Joseph, Edith, and all of our grandparents, I say, we who are your grandchildren will carry the survivors' legacy to prove to ourselves and to others that we can carry our victory, as well as to memorialize those loved ones who perished in the Holocaust. We pledge always to remember who we are, where we come from, and also the traumas our grandparents endured and survived. We pledge to educate people of other ethnic, religious, and cultural groups about our grandparents' experience. We pledge to commit to use the lessons of the Holocaust to support justice, tolerance, peace, kindness, and compassion. And we pledge to accept survivors' memories and pass them on to future generations.
Hi, I am Nava Frankel, a participant in JCRC Student-to-Student program. My grandfather, Mayor Frankel, was a Holocaust survivor.
My name is Zoe Neufeld, and I'm a participant in JCRC's Student-to-Student program. My grandparents were Holocaust survivors.
I am Greta Andelman, and my great-grandfather survived the Holocaust. Recognizing the rise of anti-Semitism and other forms of hate across the United States and the world, and remembering those who were murdered in the Holocaust, believing that the spread of bias and prejudice can be stopped and fought,
emphasizing that a unique opportunity now exists to reverse this pattern. I pledge to work to fight hate, bias, violence, and discrimination. I commit to use the lessons of the Holocaust to support justice, tolerance, peace, kindness, and compassion.
I commit to living a proud Jewish life in the memory of the 6 million who did not have that chance and to preserve our collective Jewish future. Thank you.
מלא רחמים, שוכן במרומים, המצא מנוחה נכונה תחת כנפי השכינה, עם קדושים וטהורים כזוהר הרקיע, מזהירים לנשמת יקירינו שהלכו לעולמם. בעל הרחמים יסתירם בסתר כנפיו לעולמים, ויצרו ביצרו החיים את נשמתם. אדוני הוא נחלתם, וינוחו בשלום על משכבם, ונאמר Amen. Fully compassionate God on high, to our loved ones who have entered eternity, grant clear and certain rest with you in the lofty heights of the sacred and pure, whose brightness shines like the very glow of heaven. Source of mercy, forever enfold them in the embrace of your wings. Secure their souls in eternity. Adonai, they are yours. They will rest in peace. Amen.
It is my great privilege and pleasure to introduce this year's Yom HaShoah keynote speaker, Hungarian Holocaust survivor Peter Goreg. Approximately 1.5 million Jewish children perished during the Holocaust. Only 6 to 11% of Europe's pre-war Jewish children survived, all of them in constant danger and fear, suspended in shadows that would haunt them long after the war had ended. One of these was Peter Grunwald, now Peter Goreg. Today we are witnesses to a Holocaust eyewitness as we listen and learn from Peter's experiences. Through Peter, we will remember, mourn, honor, and commit to conquering hatred and injustice, no matter when or where we see them.
Thank you, JCRC, for organizing this community commemoration of the Holocaust. I am honored to be here and to share my family's Holocaust story. Today, 7 months after the most brutal attack against the Jewish state of Israel that cost more than 1,200 innocent Jewish lives, it is incumbent upon us, all of us, more than ever, to remember the 6 million and pledge our commitment that we will never let it happen again. My parents, both of them were born on 1907 and they met in 1930. They had a long dating season, unusual in Jewish families. They got married in 1937. They had a relatively normal middle-class life in Budapest. My father, he wanted to be a lawyer, but by that time Hungary already had an anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish law which restricted the number of Jewish students in colleges and universities. He tried to get in a law school 3 times and 3 times he was rejected. So he went to do office work. Actually, he became an office manager in Budapest at a publishing company called Franklin Publishing Company. My mom started a secretarial school, but she didn't like to be in office. She didn't like paperwork. she was very good with her hands, so she enrolled in a vocational school. She wanted to be a female hat maker and milliner. She was very good at it. After finishing the vocational school, she started her own business. Her shop was actually in the apartment where my parents moved after they got married. That's the apartment where I was born into also. Until 1939, when World War II started, their life was normal. They had lots of friends. They loved outdoor activities. I have pictures of them going skiing in the winter, kayaking on the Danube River in the summer, going camping. This life was interrupted in 1939 September when World War II started. That's when the Hungarian government, as an ally of Nazi Germany, enacted anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic laws, which became stricter and stricter as time went by. The Hungarian government also needed manpower for the Hungarian army, and they tried to recruit as many males as possible. However, they did not trust Jewish people to carry weapons, rifles. So they set up something which was specific to Hungary during the Holocaust history, namely the so-called forced labor battalions. That's where my father was called up in October 1940. My mom was already pregnant with me. He was taken to this forced labor battalion for 3 months. And the way it worked, after 3 months, the people in these labor battalions got a 1-month break, and they had to go back for another 3 months. Fortunately for my mom and my dad, my father was on leave on March 10, 1941, when I was born. Unfortunately, I don't have a living memory of my father, because a year and a half later he was taken to Ukraine, where he perished during the war activities. I have a couple of pictures of him and I, and only one picture, all 3 of us, my mother and myself. We do know how my father felt while he was in this forced labor battalion, because he was allowed to send a postcard every week to my mom, and my mom preserved this postcard, and I'm in the process to translate those cards for my family, and I will donate it to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, where they can preserve it. The last card that my father sent was in December 23 or 24, right before Christmas, and no more card arrived until the Red Cross notified my mother that my father disappeared. From this card, I know how much he loved us. I know how much he missed my mom, how much he hoped and prayed that one day we are going to be reunited and would live in peace. Everything has changed in March 1944, when Nazi Germany occupied Hungary. In a matter of 3 months, approximately 450,000 Hungarian Jews were deported between April and July 1944 from Hungary. We who lived in Budapest, we were lucky because they started to round up the Jews first in the countryside, and they just didn't have the Germans and the Hungarian government, which was complicit in the deportation. It was the Hungarian police and gendarmerie who rounded up the Jews, who took them first to the ghettos and from the ghettos to the railway station and escorted the trains all the way to the Polish border when they handed all the Jews over to the Germans. We who lived in Budapest, we survived until the summer of 1944 without being threatened without deportations. Nevertheless, the life got much harder because in April 1944, the Hungarian government ordered all the Jews to move into the Budapest ghetto, or because the ghetto couldn't contain all the more than 200 Hungarian Jews, to move into so-called yellow star houses. These houses were dispersed all over Budapest. Non-Jews who lived in this apartment building had to move out and Jewish had to move in. The government put the yellow star of David on these houses, so they always knew where the Jews were while they were waiting for their deportation. My mom and I had to leave our apartment and move into one of these yellow star houses, where we lived with one other family in a one-bedroom apartment. And my memory started around this time. Usually they say that young people's memory or people's memory go back to age 3 and 3.5. And just when the Nazi occupation of Hungary happened, I turned 3. So I remember walking from my apartment building to this yellow star house. I remember seeing bombed out buildings and even dead people and dead horses on the street. So that's where we lived until October 1944, when the far-right Hungarian Fascist Party, the Arrow Cross, took over the government. First, the government ordered all the Jews to report at the Budapest railway station, from where the Jews were transported to the remaining death camps in Poland, and also to Austria and Germany, where the Germans needed slave labor. My mother didn't show up at the time at the place when they ordered the Jews to go. And a few days later, somebody reported her to the government. The police came and arrested her. She was taken away for 3 weeks, when finally she was able to escape and to come back. Meanwhile, I was taken care of practically strangers. When my mom escaped from the detention and came back, we had to move again because she didn't want to risk to have another so-called good neighbor to report us to the police. And this time we moved to another apartment building, which was again specific to the Hungarian Holocaust history. In the last year of the Holocaust, many countries, neutral countries, recognized that there were more than 2 million Jews still alive in Europe, and they started a concerted effort to save as many as possible. President Roosevelt in the United States set up the so-called War Refugee Board, and with government money and private donation, money from private donations, they sent people in diplomatic disguise to various European capitals, where they asked the embassies to use the money whichever they can in order to save Jewish life. We were lucky to get into one of these buildings protected by the Swiss embassy until the Arrow Cross, the far-right Nazi party, took over the government. They couldn't care less about international laws anymore. They started to round up the people even in these protected houses. Some of the people were taken to the shore on the banks of the Danube River. They were lined up. they had to disrobe and the people were shot into the river and the river washed away the bodies. Others were taken to the railway station and were taken to Austria and Germany to serve as slave laborers. Somebody had pity on us, I don't know how and why, and my mom couldn't explain it later either, that we ended up in the Budapest ghetto. And that's where we survived the last few weeks of the Holocaust until January 1945, when the Soviet Red Army liberated the Pest side of Budapest. Whole Budapest was liberated a month later, and whole Hungary was liberated by early April. We were free. We were free to go home. We didn't know what we're gonna find because many buildings were bombed out in Budapest, in a state where you couldn't live anymore. As a matter of fact, these bombed out buildings were very useful for those who were able to get out between two bombing raids and go through these bombed out buildings and rummaging through whatever was left. And they came back with stale bread, or in our case, my grandmother one day came back with a slab of bacon. Now, she was a very observant Orthodox Jew. She wouldn't even touch bacon, but this was war, and every calorie we could get, even from bacon, could have meant that we live 1 day longer. In 1946, my mom and I wanted to immigrate to the United States. I had an aunt and an uncle who were lucky enough to get out from Hungary and from Europe just before the Holocaust started. They lived in Baltimore, Maryland, and they would have been happy to have us. Unfortunately, the strict quota system were still in place in the United States, and while we were waiting for our visa in 1948, the Communist Party took over the government. They closed the border. We were stuck in Hungary. That's where I grew up, practically in communist Hungary. The one good thing I can tell about growing up in Hungary, that I got a good education. I became an electrical engineer. I started to work at a place where we designed the first Hungarian computers. I learned computer hardware, software on the job, because that was the early computer age when I didn't even take courses in computer science. Anyway, that skill helped me when in 1980 I was fed up with the communist system, all the lies I heard, all the propaganda, and it looked that time hopeless that system would ever change. And that's when I came to the United States as a visitor, visiting my aunt and uncle who were still alive at that time. I applied for political asylum and didn't go back until 9 years later when I became a US citizen. And also that was the year, just the year before communism collapsed in Europe. Since then, I started a new family. I have 6 children, 6 grandchildren. All of them are girls. We are still waiting for a boy. But I was happy to find a job because of my skills very easily. 30 plus years I worked mostly for government institution, mostly for NASA, and retired 10 years ago in 2014. And since then I'm a volunteer at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, where I fulfill my obligation to be a witness to the people who perished during the Holocaust. I am frequently asked what I learned from my family history and from the Holocaust. And the short answer is that the Holocaust is a unique event in history, but the consequences are universal. It was fueled by hatred, centuries of hatred against the Jewish people. So when we see hatred in our society today, discrimination, bullying, we should not be bystanders, because the Holocaust couldn't have happened hadn't been for the tens of thousands or millions of bystanders who saw what was happening to their neighbors, to their colleagues, to ordinary people. They saw them walking down the street of Budapest on their way to the railway station and ultimately to the gas chambers of Auschwitz. They saw them, they were even smiling, and did absolutely nothing. So my advice to students and young people and even grown-ups, educate yourself and educate others, so hatred will not lead to genocide again. Israel as a Jewish homeland holds a very special meaning for me as a Holocaust survivor. Had it been in existence 90 years ago, I would have been raised by a loving father and would have been grown up surrounded by caring family members. As I mourn the Jewish victims of the ongoing war in Gaza in the last 6 months, I also feel deep sympathy for the innocent Palestinian lives lost since and because of the genocidal attack of Hamas. My home for a better future has always been grounded in the upcoming generation. I believe that there is still time for them to learn history and learn the lessons of the Holocaust so they will stand on the right side of the history. Although my hope is fading, I am not ready to give up. I have an obligation to stand up for the oppressed and the persecuted and stand firm against all kinds of hatred, discrimination, regardless of who the target is. I hope you all feel the same way.
Mourner's Kaddish for the victims of the Shoah. Yitgadal, Auschwitz, Birkenau, Buna, Barankova, Bergen-Belsen. Vayit Kadash, Belzec, Bialystok, Babiyash, Mei Rabba, Bochnia, Bogdanovka, Buchenwald. Ve'amad ivra chirutei Chelmno, Krakow, Dachau, ve'amlich malchute. Dakova, Daniko, Dora, Bechayachon uv'yomachon, Dumanovka, Ebensi, Edineti, Flossenberg, V'chaye dechol Beit Yisrael, Grossrosen, Gunshirkin, Gurs, Bagala uvizman Kariv, Herzog Bush, Yasi, Yadovno, Kaiserwald, Vimru, Amen, Yehi Shmei Rabbah, Mevorach Le'elam ul Almei Almaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach. Kamenetsky, Podolsky, Kishinev, Kovno, Kluga, Vit Paar, Vit Romam, Lodz, Lubin, Lublin, Lvov, Lyon, Vit Nasev, Vit Hadar, Majdanek, Mauthausen, Minsk, Natzweiler, Struthof, Neuengamme, Vit Alev, Vit Halal, Ordrov, Plaszow, Papenburg, Ponari, Shmedekudesha, Barichu, Prague, Radom, Ravensbrück, Remsdorf, Riga, Leila, Sachsensburg, Sachsenhausen, San Saba, Shailai, Minko, Birchata, Beshirata, Skarsko, Kiemiene, Sobibor, Tushbechata, Venechemata, Theresienstadt, Transnistria, Treblinka, Vaivara, Damiran, Bealma, Vilna, Warsaw, Zimun, Zhitomir, and the scores of other camps. Vimru Amen. Yehi Shlama Rabbamin Shemaya V'Chaim Aleinu V'Al Kol Yisrael. Vimru Amen. Oseh Shalom Bimromav Hu Ya'aseh Shalom. Aleinu V'Al Kol Yisrael. Vimru Amen.
Sag nicht keinmal, als du gehst am letzten Weg. Gott Himmeln bleiene, verstellen bläue Tag. Kommen wird noch unser ausgebänkte Schau. Es wird erpeugt und unser Trott, wir seien da. Kommen wird noch unser ausgebänkte Schau. Es wird erpeugt und unser Trott, wir seien da. Das Lied geschrieben ist mit Blut und nicht mit Blei. Es ist nicht kein Liedl von a Vogel läuft da frei. Das hat der folgende gefällt zwischen Band. Das Lied gesungen mit ner Gannes in die Hand. Das hat der Volk zwischen fallen dicke Wind. Das Lied gesungen mit der Gannes in die Hand. Das sag nicht keinmal, als du gehst am letzten Weg. Gott Himmeln bleiene, verstellen bläue Tag. Kommen wird noch unser ausgebänkte Schau. Es wird erpeugt und unser Trott, wir seien da. Kommen wird noch unser ausgebänkte Schau. Es wird erpeugt und unser Trott, wir seien da.
For decades, the JCRC has organized our community-wide Yom HaShoah commemoration. It is a day that brings us together as a community to honor our survivors, those who perished, and those who fought to liberate our people. It is always, for me, personally, one of the most important and moving programs of the year. I am grateful to our survivors, their children, and grandchildren for their participation. This year, our commemoration is especially poignant. October 7th marked the single most violent day in the Jewish people's history since the Holocaust. Horrific brutality that we hoped we would never see again was once again perpetrated against innocent Jews and other Israelis. It also resulted in an increase in anti-Semitism around the world, including here in our own country. The JCRC continues to respond without apology and without fear. We will not back down in the face of bullying, intimidation, and violence. We will confront all manifestations of anti-Semitism. We lobby throughout the region to increase Holocaust education and to secure government dollars to provide critical services to Holocaust survivors and security for our institutions. We denounce all anti-Semitism and work with community leaders to do the same. We work with law enforcement to create a more secure community for all. This year, the JCRC will bring Holocaust survivors and their descendants to local schools to speak to 10,000 students about their families' Shoah experiences and about the importance of confronting hatred. Our student-to-student program trains our young leaders to educate their peers about what it means to be Jewish teenagers today. We train administrators and educators to better understand Judaism, anti-Semitism, and anti-Zionism, and ensure that the Holocaust, Judaism, and Israel are properly taught in our schools, and that schools are nurturing environments for Jewish students and faculty, and we are tirelessly advocating in support of Israel. Thank you to the clergy, musicians, speakers, and JCRC leadership and staff for bringing us together for today's meaningful program. The Jewish community of Greater Washington continues to demonstrate strength, unity, and hope, both throughout the years and during this time of deep sorrow. Together, we will face the threats of our community and emerge stronger than ever. We invite you to join with us tomorrow evening, May 6, 7 p.m. at 6th and I, for an in-person program coordinated by our partners, 3GDC. Let us conclude this beautiful commemoration on a hopeful note as we join in the singing of Hatikvah.